on the road to becoming millionaires because I put profit in the title of the slideshow, of the talk. So you know that that's the end result. Or your money back. Cool. So yeah, so Hedy called it research. I call it just playing games. I do a lot of it. I'm also more involved than I would say the average person. I have a group that I've started with friends. We've incorporated as an LLC. We don't make any money, but we call ourselves Big Blue Esports, and we are running Boston's largest ever Smash tournament next weekend. It's called Shine 2016. The numbers as of right now, we have 1,500 registrants, and we have, let's see, I think we are now the 7th largest Super Smash Bros. Melee tournament of all time. So that is happening in Boston, and it has never happened in this area before. So this is something we're trying to really get the Boston community excited about, and the Smash community as a whole. But that's really just one part of what I think about and do in terms of games. As Hedy said, I also like to think about games and what makes them work, what makes them fun, and also like things are not really, games don't really appear out of thin air, right? They are products. They make people money, or they have to in order to be sustainable. So I'm not going to tell you how to become a millionaire, but I will briefly examine what makes a game viable and commercially viable. But mostly I just want to talk about games and what makes them so cool and fun and interesting and competing and why we care about it and why we like it. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I'm going to be talking about. If you want to hear more about the Smash thing and all that later, I can talk more about it after the actual talk. So let me know. Cool. So in order for us to talk first, to talk about what makes a viable competitive game, what makes it fun, what makes it competitive, we're going to have to first talk about what are all these things. So what is a game? My working definition for the purposes of this talk is an activity that people engage in for diversion or amusement. Pretty vague, right? We all enjoy some form of gaming, not necessarily the hardcore video gaming or what have you that I'm kind of more interested in, but everyone does some form of gaming of some kind, right? We all like to have fun. Here's some examples of games that you might have played or seen, or so we have things all from chess, which is a kind of a classic board game with kind of a very competitive history and like a long history. But we also have other pastimes. There's choose your own adventure novels is a type of game, right? Like people do that for fun, for amusement. It's kind of a thing that you kind of have rules, you have choices. I'm not particularly interested in like rules and choices and all that in terms of what makes a game. It's just something that you do for fun, right? I think that's the most important part here to capture. Angry Birds, baseball, games are everywhere. We've all seen them. You've probably played some yourself. So. The thing that I'm more interested today, though, is competitive gaming, and what does that really mean? So what is a competitive game? A competitive game is a game in which there are players in some sort of opposition, the outcome of which has to be decided according to a set of rules. So basically, if you and I decide to play a game in which we're competing, we have to agree to some set of rules, and we have to agree that there's going to be a winner and a loser, right? There's kind of that aspect to competitive games. And when you hear a lot of people talk about competition, it's all about like winning and losing, and I kind of really want to unpack that. I think that it's really about a lot more than that. But at the surface level, competitive games, there's a winner and there's a loser. There's a set of rules, there's an outcome. And of course, in order to have one, you have to have the other, right? Okay, so whenever there's a kind of a winner and a loser, this outcome, this set of rules, these kinds of things, there's a real challenge that we have. Competitive games are hard to design, and I've played quite a few of them, and I can tell you some of them are more successful than others. You've probably played quite a few of them yourself. Maybe you didn't even know it. So, but it's all about the balance. What are we trying to balance in a competitive game? Well, it turns out that some of the things you can balance in a competitive game are, is it fun? Is it rewarding? So that's the kind of the glory piece of my thing. But it's not the kind of glory where you're like, oh, I'm the gold medalist on the top of the world. It's like it's more than just that. It's what do we get out of winning and losing? What do we get out of competing? The act itself, not necessarily the result. But also, as I said, in general, competitive games they tend to be products, right? Like of course, you've seen baseball, for example, is a competitive game, and now I showed it one of the first slides. Now, while that is a competitive game, it's not really a product, so I'm not really going to be concerned about designing those types of games at least in this talk. But that is a different kind of design, and also worth thinking about and very interesting. But for the purpose of this talk, I put profit in the title, so I'm going to talk about the kinds of games you can actually sell. Okay. Right. So now we've sort of at least reached an agreement that we have to sort of provide some sort of balance to the players of the game. What are those things that we're going to provide to the player? Well, one of them is the sense of fun. And we've sort of already defined games as something that you do for fun. So I think it's only natural that a competitive game has to feel fun to somebody, right? So what makes a game fun? I mean, it has to be enjoyable or amusing. Seems pretty vague, right? But let's dig into this a little bit more. There's a lot of things that go into this because different people find different things fun. So, the same things that we find fun, your friend may not find fun. And you've seen this in your own lives, right? How hard is it to convince somebody to do this, one of your favorite things if they're just not interested in playing that game with you? It can be hard. Not everyone finds everything fun. But that's fine, because there's lots of reasons that people find games fun. People find it relaxing to sometimes play certain types of games. So obviously flying a kite is not a competitive game, but that is one of the types of things that you can do for fun. So I call it a game, right? Not a competitive game, but it's a game, and people find it relaxing, and so that's one of the aspects, for sure. But people also play games for the challenge, right? And there's all sorts of different kinds of challenge. One particular type of challenge is the mental challenge. Games can cause you to think really hard about things. If you've ever played Go, you probably know that it's a pretty strategic game. It's so simple. All you do is put stones down on a board, but there's so much thought going into every single placement. Such a fascinating game. But people also really like the physical aspects of certain types of games, right? That's you can sort of yeah. I mean, you see this all the time on TV, right? People love spectating sports because of this excitement of the kind of the physicality of the aspect of it. So that can be really fun to a lot of people. Games also allow us to socialize, right? This is a pub trivia, I guess, scene. You can see that there's a lot of people who are engaged in this activity, but why are they there? I don't think most people would find pub trivia fun if they were the only person participating. It doesn't seem very fun, and I think that's because of the social aspect of it. So that's another aspect that you can build into a game. Gaming can be a diversion. It's just takes you out of your flow of everyday life, right? And you're doing something else. And we've seen this in our society today where people are often very diverted to their cell phones. But what are they doing on their cell phones? Well, they could be playing a game. But yeah, definitely for a lot of people, it's all about taking themselves out of their, the daily grind, doing something a little different. So that's diversionary. And also some fun things about games. You can find the aesthetics of them interesting or pleasing, right? If you ever played a Final Fantasy game, you know they really, really, really care about their graphics and their sound, and sometimes at the expense of other things. But that's not of interest right now. But but it's a pretty game, I guess. It's nice to look at. This is all rendered 3D stuff. It's probably a scene you could find in the game itself. It looks really pretty. I don't know. It's nice. But anyway, that's enough about fun. No more fun allowed. We're going to talk about the serious stuff. So we know that there's a lot of things about the games that lend themselves to fun. But how do they become part of a competitive game? How does a game get competitive in the first place? What does it mean to compete? What is a competitor? I love talking about this stuff. Okay, so a lot of people think that people enjoy competing because people like winning. I agree. People like winning. But clearly, I don't think that that's enough. Because people are like, oh, all that matters is that you win, but that's not really why people compete. And I'll sort of prove it to you. I think it's much more the case, actually, that people like being rewarded for efforts that they undertake. And I think people have to sort of feel that something about it was worth it, right? And what is that? So something I'm going to try to understand here. And I think one way we could do this is we can talk about 2 different types of games that you could win or lose. So does anyone have a coin? Borrow. Does nobody carry cash in this day and age? I don't. All right, never mind. All right. I sort of got one. Which one feels more rewarding? Let's say heads I win, tails you win. Okay, I flip a coin, tails. All right, Peter, you win. How do you feel? Great. All right, you're a winner. Okay, let's talk about a different game, different scenario. Peter, you just won the marathon. How do you feel?
Ecstatic. I beat the world.
Okay, so obviously this is an extreme example, but under my definition of what a competitive game is, we agreed to rules. In the first case, we flipped a coin. We decided the winner would be decided by the outcome. In this case, we decided that we were going to run 20 plus miles and that the winner would be decided by the first person to cross the finish line, right? I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room finds one of these things a little more rewarding than the other. So I think there's definitely a lot more to this whole aspect of competing rather than just the pure outcome of it. So it's really about the journey. And I think because of that, there's so many things that competing can teach people about themselves. And I think that's really what becomes rewarding. I think that's what's really so interesting about putting people in these kind of opposing situations, putting them against each other. Turns out that competition can really teach us a lot about people and ourselves. So every, I guess, non-trivial competitive endeavor is an exercise in delayed gratification, right? So what's the investment for flipping a coin? Well, you got to find a coin and then you got to flip it. Great. I don't know, not that rewarding to me. But you've won the marathon, and let's say that other people were running it too, I guess. People who can also run marathons were running it too, right? Do you go out tomorrow and run a marathon that you have not been training for? I don't. So I'm guessing most people probably can't, right? That's the delayed gratification aspect. There are things you have to actually learn or practice or train for to be able to compete at that kind of marathon level, right? And that's the exercise in delayed gratification. So there's an interesting study that some Stanford researchers did back in like the 70s or something. You can look at the Wikipedia article on this, but so let me basically explain the experiment. There were children divided into 2 groups, or no, actually, sorry. There were children presented with 2 options, okay? And the options were the child could take a marshmallow, or the child could wait 15 minutes and take 2 marshmallows. Okay, it's a very interesting study. So what they ended up doing with those results is then they divided the children into 2 groups. There was the children who took the marshmallow immediately, and the children who took the marshmallow after waiting. So they got more reward for delaying their gratification. It turns out that they tracked these children's lives, and the ones who were able to wait for the 2 marshmallows had better SAT scores, better educational attainment, and overall just better life metrics, like all those other random numbers that people come up with to decide whether you're a successful person or whatever. Those people had them. Whereas the children who did not wait tended not to have those statistics. Very interesting. So people who can participate in a delayed gratification sort of way, they end up being better people. I don't know. It's an interesting metric. Or maybe I'm overloading the term better, but certainly is interesting to me. Right. So investing any effort in any like non-trivial competitive endeavor really requires that you are able to delay gratification. So I think there's a lot more than that too, though. There's a lot of things that go into competing. One of those things is you have to really be able to understand yourself. And so competitors have to learn to do all these things to sort of get better at what they're doing, right? We talked about marathon running, but there's so many other different types of competition that we'll sort of get to in a sec. But yeah, I mean, you have to be able to understand yourself, right? If you know that you can't, I don't know, run 26 miles tomorrow, right? You have to be able to understand why and what it takes to get there. Let's say you don't know how to serve tennis serve, right? You're gonna have to learn how to do that someday, and you have to figure out what you're doing as you're doing it, and that really takes some self-reflection. Not a skill that everyone is great at, so something that competitors probably are better at than non-competitors. I don't know. We'll see. Competitors also have to learn to analyze and solve problems. So I guess when I say competitors here, I'm talking about anyone who participates in trying to get good at a competitive endeavor, right? So analyzing and solving problems, definitely an interesting part of competition. Definitely can't win chess games and those types of things without having thought about it somewhat. Really important life skill here is competitors learn to cope with setbacks, right? There's no such thing as a perfect win rate. If people are really investing a lot of effort into their competitive endeavors, I feel like those people would probably be sad if they didn't see the effects of their outcomes come out positively. So how do you deal with that? It's a very interesting psychological concept of being able to cope with setbacks, and I'm not going to go too deep into it right now, but it's definitely a big part of it. And I think competitors, partly because of this whole coping and delayed gratification thing, is competitors really have to learn to empower themselves to affect their outcomes, right? I think this is especially true as the games get less trivial. So I would say flipping a coin is probably not the best example of this, but any sort of non-trivial endeavor, I really see that this sort of brings this out in people. Okay. So I don't know. I think competitive games in general are pretty good for people, I think. And I don't know. I think that there's a lot of stigma in our society against that. And I think it has something to do with unhealthy competition. And definitely, I would recommend against those types of practices. I'm not recommending that you take steroids to run a race, right? Those types of things. I don't find that those are healthy competition. But I think that in sort of its best form, the right type of competition can be really good for just life skills and, I don't know, like being a more well-adjusted and empowered person. So, I don't know. I think it's pretty good for you. You might disagree. You can tell me later if you do. Right. So, yeah. Competing at a high level is hard. We've talked about how this really affects, like, what it means to be able to apply yourself to a task and, like, delay your gratification and affect your outcomes. Why is it so hard? Well, so there's this concept in competing, and this really gets it into the sort of the design aspect of like how you go about getting people interested in your games. So let's say you're trying to design a competitive game, right? Now we sort of understand like why people play, why people compete, maybe why it's good for you, maybe why it's interesting to spectators, those kinds of things. Let's talk about how to make a game competitive. So one of the aspects of making a game for a competitive game is barriers to entry, right? I think a lot of people fall by the wayside of difficult games because the setting out to become a competitor can feel really daunting, right? So what are those things that sort of make it difficult to get into a game? There's quite a few of them, and it's really interesting to examine, I think, and think about which ones of these you want to present to people. Because we're going to examine the flip side of it, right? Like having a difficult barrier to entry turns people away from a game, but just because a game is easy doesn't mean people want to play it, and I think that's sort of the flip side of the coin, so to speak. And we'll get to that. But first, let's talk about why it can be hard to learn games. Complex mechanics or instructions. So if you've ever played fighting games, you might recognize some of these inputs. But if you've never played a fighting game before, this doesn't mean anything to you. This is like basically code for how to move your control stick and press buttons at the same time in order to play. In order to perform a combination of moves on your opponent. And this is just a list of instructions. It doesn't even tell you, like, why are you doing this? Okay. So this happens to be from a game called BlazBlue. It's a pretty technical, complicated fighting game. And that's definitely difficult for people to sort of wrap their heads around the first time around. I certainly know. I've been trying to play BlazBlue. In fact, I play this character too, but that's not important. So yeah, so that's sort of like just being able to do the thing. But then there's this idea of the deep, mature metagame. So if you're not familiar with competitive lingo, metagame may be a kind of a foreign concept to you. So I sort of want to explain it. If you've ever seen a chess book, how many of you have played chess in some form or another? I don't mean like you have to have entered a tournament or whatever. Yeah, pretty much everyone is at least familiar with the rules. But a lot of you may not know that in fact over the hundreds of years, the way people have played chess, the rules have not changed. But the way people play out their games has changed dramatically over hundreds of years. That's called the metagame. People are interested in chess because it teaches us so much about games that have not changed their rules or mechanics, but have changed the way that the games have played. Basically, it results in people discovering new lines of attack, people like discovering new openings and trying new combinations and things like that. And it's a game that hasn't changed in hundreds of years. But what do you do if you start to learn chess today, hundreds of years after the game was invented? Well, you kind of have to study up on those hundreds of years. You have to understand, like, you don't just put your flank pawn out as your first move. Like a lot of people try that. They're like, oh, I can get my rooks out. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just it's okay. But if you move your pawns on the side to try to get your rooks out, like a lot of people think that that's a valid tactic. But unfortunately, hundreds of years of experience have taught competitors in chess that is a really bad idea. But how do you know that? I mean, today, the way you learn that is by studying chess. And studying chess is really hard. Chess is, I think, the first most written about game in the world. I think there's the most books ever produced about a game is about chess. So it can be really hard to get into chess. And you sort of can see why. It's just, there's so much to know. Then there's a different type of investment. You might have heard of this game called Magic the Gathering. It's a collectible trading card game with, I think, decades of history and a very interesting profit model. So it's so interesting to me that there are YouTube videos that are trying to tell you whether it's worth it to buy Magic cards, right? Because it's such a difficult, expensive, and complicated hobby. And you need the cards in order to play, right? You don't just play Magic in your head, or I mean, I guess there's now like Magic Online, but they have a similar profit model there where you have to buy random cards. Now, if you've never opened a booster pack before, basically what happens is, in order to play the game of Magic, you first have to get a bunch of cards. But those cards are probably not very good, at least when you start out, right? They sort of purposefully hide some of the best cards with kind of this rarity factor. In other words, it's really difficult to obtain good stuff in Magic the Gathering. And they do that on purpose. They want you to buy a whole bunch of these random packs, and hopefully one day you open one and there's this really cool rare card that's really good. But I don't know, it's just like it's so daunting to begin collecting Magic cards, right? You have to buy hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars worth of cardboard to get into a competitive game. And is it worth it? I don't know. Like, you have to really, really want it, I think, and have money. Finally, there's execution. So these are the types of barriers to entry where it's not overly complex or complicated, like maybe a long combo list is. It may not be particularly expensive to go out on a tennis court and start grabbing a racket and serving. But certainly, it's really hard to serve like the pros. Why? Because it's hard to execute a serve. You have to be so, you have to have so much power and technique, and that kind of thing is hard. So these are all just kind of ways that make it more difficult for people to get into games. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. Are you having fun yet? Cool. I mean, this is a really interesting question to ask as people are starting to get along in learning a game. Is the learning curve suited to your audience? So, in other words, games have to feel rewarding and interesting enough to justify their barriers to entry. And how do you balance that? Well, you have to sort of keep things interesting, right? You have to have people want to watch, play, and compete in your game, right? So there's got to be some sort of fun factor. I don't think games can be purely competitive without being fun. I don't think people would be playing those things. Certainly, I don't play competitive coin flipping because I just don't find it very fun, right? Like it's an example I'm going to keep coming back to, or rock paper scissors is probably a little more fun than flipping a coin, but I don't know, it doesn't feel that fun, and we're gonna sort of unpack why that doesn't feel so interesting or fun to us. How do you keep things interesting? Well, one way is variety. People don't always enjoy playing or spectating games if the same thing is happening every single time, right? That's sort of why I gave up on competitive tic-tac-toe. It's not very, I don't know, interesting. Competitive balance. The whole talk of this, the whole topic of my talk is about balance, and there's lots of different things I've talked about being in balance already. There's balancing, fun versus competitiveness versus like kind of being a cash grabby cash monster and actually being able to play the game and things like that. But there's this whole concept of competitive balance I think is really interesting. Competitive balance is what keeps games interesting and fresh. What do I mean by that? It's not strictly true that competitive balance has to be perfect balance. So let's think of some perfectly balanced games. I've already talked about a couple of them. Flipping a coin is ideally perfectly balanced if you have a balanced coin. 50% of the time, it'll be heads. 50% of the time, it'll be tails. Rock, paper, scissors is perfectly balanced, right? Excuse me. There's one winner. There's always one move or whatever move that you can throw that beats the other move that the other person could throw, but then there's one that beats you, right? Rock, paper, scissors. So is that important or possible to even have perfect balance? I think it can be really difficult to have balance when you want to also keep your game interesting and fresh. So that's why we talk about sort of the difficulty of balance. It's so complex. So now we said, to keep things interesting, we want to present a variety of options, of choices, and strategies, or teams, or players, or team compositions, players, something like that. We want to be able to vary all those things in our competitive games. But the problem is when you introduce a lot of variety into a game, keeping those things balanced is very difficult. Just the larger the number of possible interactions you have in your game, the more difficult it is to make sure that those things are all still competitive and interesting and fun, and yeah, so it's hard. So how can you kind of sort of mitigate that? Well, we sort of have this inherent sense. We have this sense that anything with an advantage must have an inherent drawback, right? So any strategy that's particularly has some strong points or strong attributes should probably have some inherent weaknesses to balance them. But also, and I think this one is overlooked a lot. So a lot of you have probably heard about games feeling imbalanced. So what does that mean? I'm going to tell a story in a second about kind of a group of people who found something very imbalanced and why that felt that way. But I think it's because if something doesn't feel fun when someone is winning or losing, then it doesn't really feel balanced. So, okay, so I'm going to dig into that a little bit deeper with the story. So I play this game called Netrunner. It's pretty fun. It's about like a corporation and a runner and like basically a hacker trying to steal some stuff out of a company's servers. Very appropriate, I'm sure, for this type of work. But basically, there's this rule in the game. The corporation has a time limit that they must complete the game by, or else they lose. And that time limit is basically, if they run out of cards, they lose the game. The runner does not have this stipulation, so it's an asymmetrical game. It's very interesting. But what happened when they printed Museum of History? Well, so this card's text says, when your turn begins, you may shuffle one card, and there's some technical terms here, from your discard pile into your deck. So what that means is this card basically invalidates one of the kind of rules of Netrunner, which is that the corporation has this time limit by which they must complete their agendas. Now, this card became really popular, right? It allowed corporation players, which actually everyone's a corporation player. It allowed people to put corporations together whose decks were not affected by this rule. They've essentially like broken one of the main rules of Netrunner. So this deck was winning a lot, and people complained. They said only people who are interested in winning are finding this game fun right now. Okay, so that's cool and all. So people don't find it fun to have this deck that sort of like repeats itself over and over and over again, and there's never a time limit, and it can't run out. But what about the people who found Museum of History fun? I don't know. I think it's kind of unfair to say that something is. So what happened was, as a result of the Museum of History, people decried the design of Netrunner was now just everything was gone into the dumpster, and no one was enjoying the game. Only people who were trying hard enjoyed the game, and those people who were playing for fun no longer could have fun, and therefore the game was imbalanced, or something like that. Now, the problem with that statement is, of course, that everyone finds different things fun, and some people love Museum of History. So I really think that in order to have your game feel competitive, balanced, and fun, the only thing that really matters is that enough of your players have to actually enjoy the strategies that attain victory in order for your game to feel fun and balanced. Another way you can sort of look at it is people enjoy a good underdog story. So what that means is, like, even if there are elements of the game that are not necessarily as competitive as others, people really enjoy this sort of story of like the less dominant player having a chance at winning. So who would watch, I don't know, baseball or whatever if the same team won every time? I don't think very many people would, right? So there's this idea we have to think about how to build variance into our games so that the game feels fresh. One way you could do that is by random chance. So there's always chance elements in card drawing games, for instance. You never know what card you're going to draw next. There's not really an element of that in baseball, but there are other ways you can balance it too. So putting people on a team is kind of sort of an interesting balancing effect, because teams can sort of change their composition. They can, think about team strategies that other teams haven't used. there's lots of ways to sort of try this. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but it's just something to think about. Okay, so we talked about barriers to entry, but why do people want to go all the way and compete in your game anyway? So I think it's because the games feel deep and rewarding enough to some players who are interested in competing and improving in the game. And I think what that means is you have to sort of design a game in which the actual improvement part, like the actual competing and getting better and like learning more about the game, has to have enough challenge, has to have enough depth. Now that's sort of at odds with what I was saying earlier about lowering the barrier to entry so that people will actually want to play your game. But that's one of the things. That's the challenge. You have to be able to balance, I think, both sides of that equation. Okay. So I've talked a lot about competing and kind of rambled on about balance, about competitive balance and stuff. Let's talk about money. Games that are successful have to feel like they're worth it, right? If you want to kind of develop a game as a product, again, baseball's not a great example because no one person can really monetize baseball in its entirety. But let's say you're designing an enclosed kind of system as a game, right? Does it feel worth it? I don't know. I think it comes down to knowing your audience. What are your players interested in? Are they interested in collecting? Are they interested in subscribing to something and then just sort of having that thing come to them all the time? Are they interested in recruiting their friends that, oh, hey, you really have to play this game? Like, oh, how do I play it? Well, you got to go on Amazon and order a copy. Oh, okay. Or are you maybe taking a different approach, like enabling or licensing third-party vendors? I don't know. These are all kind of strategies you can use to monetize your games. But the important thing is your players can't feel like that you're cheapening the experience. Now, what do I mean by that? There's a sort of phenomenon in gaming recently that's known as free-to-play. And if you know anything about free-to-play, you know that it's not free. Because one thing that happens often with free-to-play games is that these developers start developing this model where you have to pay to get access to the things that you need to win. So we call that pay to win. It feels cheap. Even though you're paying a lot of money to somebody, it feels cheap, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, I think we talked about this earlier where competitors are really interested in sort of like the reward aspect of their efforts versus the outcomes. And I don't know, does it feel rewarding to be able to buy victory? Not really in the sense of competing. I don't know, it just doesn't feel very good, right? So I think that the majority of people will eventually realize this and lose interest. And you see this sort of in the free-to-play versus subscription models for certain games. It's often the case that free-to-play models lose interest in their audiences more quickly, and it just happens to be the case. But I think this is partly why. Okay. So, I guess we're going to try to wrap it up in a bit of a unifying message here, I guess. I kind of rambled about a lot of things, but they all sort of boil down to this, I think. To design a competitive game, you have to, or to get people to actually want to play and buy and whatever, spectate or participate in your game, I think you do have to balance a lot of factors. So I think one thing you have to balance is that there have to be, you have to balance the idea of having a wide variety, a large variance, a great number of choices available to your players so that people feel interested and find it fun. But enough of these choices have to actually have a reasonable chance at winning, right? The more choices you present to your audience, the fewer of them, well, the harder it is to make sure that all of them are viable choices, right? So that's one kind of aspect that you have to balance. The other thing you have to balance is barrier to entry versus competitive depth. And we sort of talked about how difficult it is to sort of get into chess because of this complicated system, metagame, and openings and all that stuff. But it has to be reasonable in what it asks of learners, but at the same time feel challenging to people who are playing for their 3,000th game or whatever it is that they're playing, right? Like, I think that's pretty challenging. And finally, you have to be able to make the game accessible to enough people who want to try to play the game. But I guess if you want to try to make money off of your game, you do have to have some sort of business model that supports its existence. And that's something that you have to balance so the game doesn't feel, I don't know, unfair, cheap. So yeah, I think it is possible to develop a game that is fun, competitive, and commercially viable. I think, though, that it does sort of require that you go out and play some games. I think being able to understand the sort of the mindset of the competitor or the player, I think that's really what makes it. That's really like you have to learn how to speak to those kinds of desires. I think to feel rewarded, to sort of have fun, and also not feel like you're stealing their money. So I don't know. I think if there's any message I want to leave people with, I think it's that don't be afraid of competing. I think it's a really interesting thing. I feel like I sort of just rambled about why people like competing, and maybe if that's all that I really accomplished today, that's fine. Maybe you'll be more interested in it next time. But yeah, certainly all of these lessons you learn, I think, by doing the thing. So, okay. I think that's all I have. So I talked about a little bit of some of the stuff I plugged earlier. I'm running this tournament next week, and I love playing competitive games. So if you want to talk to me about any of them, you can tweet at me, or you can talk to me here. That's it. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah?
So, I was kind of struck by. Oh, I don't know if I need this. I was kind of struck by this game, Flappy Bird, that came out a while ago. You know, it seemed like really low barrier to entry, but also like way too hard, maybe, or something. And yet, it seemed like it was really popular. I don't know if it was an illusion that it was really popular. Maybe it wasn't as popular as it seemed. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on like games that are kind of seem like broken in some way, but yet they're still really popular and people like to play them?
Yeah. So I think I actually have not played Flappy Bird, but I think I know what you're talking about. So you're talking about a game that feels really easy to get into, feels fun, but it's what, like too difficult to actually beat? Is that the idea?
Die after 5 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. We call that fake difficulty in game design, and it's like when you make a game sort of arbitrarily difficult. And this is kind of a weird concept because, I mean, okay, so I think the easiest way to describe fake difficulty is if you think about a game that has an infinite runtime. So in other words, you can never beat the game. That's one way you can sort of create fake difficulty because there's no way to win. I don't know if actually Flappy Bird has a way to win. Do you know? I don't know. Maybe no one found out. Just a high score. Yeah. Yep. So that's one way you can fake difficulty. I don't know. Does it feel fun to you? Doesn't seem fun. All right. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Fake difficulty is one of those things that I think eventually tires people out.
But the guy made a huge amount of money.
Yes. And yeah, low barrier to entry. Yeah, that's one formula, I guess. Maybe it'll make you millions too. I don't know.
Okay, the pay to win reminded me a lot of like Pokemon Go and things like that, right? Total play to win strategy. And then I kind of just wonder, and I don't know if you know, what happens to games like that as people lose interest?
So I actually also haven't really played Pokemon Go, but from what I've heard of it, are there microtransactions? Like you can pay to do some things? Yeah. So one thing that happens with a lot of microtransaction games is that the churn is much higher. Free to play is a very low barrier to entry, but pay to win is a very sort of cheapening balancing tactic. So in other words, the people who pay have an unfair advantage over those people who don't, and that doesn't really feel fair or balanced to people. So I think people stop taking the results of the game seriously. And I think that's even if it's a non-competitive game like Pokemon Go, or what I mean by that is not head-to-head, but like even if it's a game like Pokemon Go and you're not really like beating the game or winning, I still think that people feel like people feel like they don't really get anything out of the game if their efforts don't really map to something that they sort of either a choice they made or some sort of like action that they took or skill that they have. I think it just feels dull and cheap and not fun. Any others? All right. Thank you, guys.